There are different types of worship. Some people tend to be very expressive, some people tend to be very reserved. Worship is, well, as Jesus put it, he said that those who worship must worship in spirit and in truth. In other words, in reality, it is both a subjective and objective aspect. It is subjective to an individual's personality, who they are, but it is objective because it must be contained within truth as well. But sometimes, you might be in a worship service or something like that, and you see someone do something that might make you a little uncomfortable. And there's not necessarily anything wrong with it, but it's maybe out of the norm. Culture plays a huge role in this. A little background into this story that we're going to look at this morning. The Ark of the Covenant had been captured by the Philistines years before, and they thought that they had just captured another prize. And so they put it up with their other gods and everything else, and God began to work, and he brought plagues on the Philistines until the Philistines said, okay, we need to return the ark back to the Israelites, and they brought it back, and they gave it to a person by the name of Abinadab, and it stayed in his home for quite some time rather than the tabernacle, and it had been there, and Abinadab had been greatly blessed as a result. Well, all of that had happened under Saul. David comes in as king after the death of Saul. He finally ascends to the throne, and David decides that he wants to have the Ark of the Covenant in his capital. And that's where this story picks up in verse number 1 of 2 Samuel 6. It says, David again assembled all the choice men in Israel, 30,000. He and all his troops set out to bring the Ark of God from Baal, Judah. The Ark is called by the name of the Yahweh of hosts, who dwells between the cherubim. They set the Ark of God on a new cart and transported it from Abinadab's house, which was on a hill. Uzzah and Ahio, sons of Abinadab, were guiding the cart, and brought it with the Ark of God from Abinadab's house on the hill. Ahio walked in front of the ark, and David and the whole house of Israel were celebrating before the Lord with all kinds of fir-wood instruments, lyres, harps, tambourines, sistrums, and cymbals. And when they came to Nachon's threshing floor, Uzzah reached out to the ark of God and took hold of it because the oxen had stumbled. Then the Lord's anger burned against Uzzah, and God struck him dead on the spot for his irreverence, and he died there next to the ark of God. And David was angry because of the Lord's outburst against Uzzah, so he named that place an outburst against Uzzah, as it is this day. And David feared the Lord that day and said, how can the ark of the Lord ever come to me? So he was not willing to move the ark of the Lord to the city of David. Instead, he took it to the house of Obed-Edom, the Gittite. And the ark of the Lord remained in his house 3 months, and the Lord blessed Obed-Edom and his whole family. So again, this is early on in David's reign, and he's the new king. He wants the Ark of the Covenant to be in his capital, in Jerusalem. And his idea is this: I want to honor God. I want the Lord to be at the center. I want the Lord to be, in the center of governmental power. He's having all of the right ideas here. He wants the Lord's presence in his life and in his reign and in his rule. He wants the Lord to be very influential in his kingdom and in the politics and the policies that he puts forward as the king. But David also wants to do this very quickly. He wants to honor God, but he wants to do it very quickly. So he gathers this group of soldiers to go down to Abinadab's house and to bring the ark back to Jerusalem. And they get there and they say, okay, let's just put it on a cart. This will be a whole lot faster than trying to gather the people to carry it. let's go on ahead and do that. And so they start down the road, and that's where we start running into problems. They get a little ways down the road, and the ox that's pulling the cart, it stumbles. The ark looks a little shaky, looks like it might fall off, and Uzzah reaches up to steady the ark. And here's what you need to understand. David's motivation was good. Uzzah's motivation was good. They were trying to do right things. The problem is not in their motivation, but in their action. We oftentimes hear people say, well, just do your best and it'll be okay with God. Or do what you think is right and the Lord will understand. These are not actually true statements per se. Just because you have good motivations doesn't mean that you can do whatever you want. Having a good motivation is no excuse for a sinful action. People do this, and it's kind of human nature, but people do this all the time. They will take a sinful action, but they will do it, and they will have, quite honestly, good motivation. It's still sinful action. Uzzah's touching the ark, even to steady it, was actually the last straw in the disobedience that was shown in transporting the ark. You see, God had laid out the instructions very, very clearly in terms of how the Ark of the Covenant was to be moved. It was to be carried by the members of Korath's family. It was to be carried by hand, never in a cart, never in any other way. The Korath's family were, of course, Levites. The ark was supposed to be covered with special protection coverings. All of these things were supposed to happen. And everything that they were doing and how they were doing it was wrong. How they were trying to get the ark from Abinadab's house to Jerusalem was wrong. No one was supposed to touch the ark. No one at all was permitted to touch the Ark of the Covenant, period. And Uzzah, when he reached up, he saw that the oxen stumbled. He reaches up to touch it. That was the last straw. Because here's what's really happening here. It's not just that Uzzah touched the ark. That was just the last part of this. God's anger had grown and grown and grown in how they were doing it because they had completely ignored his instructions. And so Uzzah is the last straw, and so he suffers the consequences. And by the way, the consequences for touching the ark are laid out in the law. That was well known. This is not something that should have been a big shocker. And so David gets angry, and his anger is not specifically directed against God, but he's angry because God chose to bring these consequences for his error and for the error of Uzzah. But David doesn't immediately pick up on the fact of what he's done that's wrong. Instead, David thinks that in some way, shape, or form, he's been rejected by God, that God has not chosen to honor his kingship and not honor his rule. And so David is concerned, well, what happens if I go on ahead and bring the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem? And so instead, he chooses to leave it. He leaves it in the house of this man, Obed-Edom, and he goes back to Jerusalem. And for 3 months, he's sitting there trying to figure this out. What happened? And all that time, in the meantime, Obed-Edom's home is being greatly, greatly blessed. Because in Obed-Edom's home, they're honoring God, but they're not touching the ark, they're not engaging, they're not doing anything wrong. They're just taking care and protecting and guarding the ark. And so God honors them. God blesses them greatly. And so you come to verse number 12, and it says, "It was reported to King David, the Lord has blessed Obed-Edom's family and all that belongs to him because of the ark of God. So David went and had the ark of God brought up from Obed-Edom's house to the city of David with rejoicing. When those carrying the ark of the Lord advanced 6 steps, he sacrificed an ox and a fatted calf. And David was dancing with all his might before the Lord, wearing a linen ephod. And he and the whole house of Israel were bringing up the ark of the Lord with shouts and the sound of the ram's horn. As the ark of the Lord was entering the city of David, Saul's daughter Michal looked down from the window and saw King David leaping and dancing before the Lord, and she despised him in her heart." So word comes to David that Obed-Edom has not suffered any negative consequences from having the ark in the home. In fact, quite the opposite. He's been blessed tremendously. And so David says, okay, well, if God is blessing, then that means that God has not rejected me. He hasn't rejected Israel. There must be something else here. And so he decides, maybe it wasn't the issue of me bringing the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem. Maybe it was how I brought the Ark of the Covenant. And so he goes back to Obed-Edom's house, but this time he decides to do it right. He decides to do it in truth. Remember, I referenced that earlier, where Jesus tells the woman at the well that those who worship him must worship in spirit and in truth. In other words, you have to be right. You have to be objectively correct with what God has laid out. That was David's problem in the first place. And so the blessings on Obed-Edom were confirmation that God was not rejecting Israel or its king, but the evidence that David had been wrong in how he does it. So David goes back and he follows the instructions this time. It says in verse 13 specifically, when those carrying the ark of the Lord, in other words, it's being carried by hand. It's being done the proper way. It's being done by the proper people. All of this is being done this time in the way that God said to do it. And so what David does is he says, okay, here's what I'm going to do. We're still going to have the celebration. We're still going to be worshiping. We're still going to have the instruments playing. We're still going to do all of this, but we're going to go about it the right way. So they follow the instructions, but David takes it one step further. This is not commanded in the Word of God, but David says, here's what I'm going to do. They're going to carry it 6 steps. We're going to stop and we're going to do a sacrifice and an offering. And then we're going to do 6 more steps and we're going to do again. And David is dancing and celebrating. It says that he was wearing this linen ephod. Oftentimes it's referred to that David was naked. That's not entirely true, but what he's wearing is very limited. It was kind of a tunic, what we might consider as a tunic, went down to about mid-thigh, and it was open on the sides, tied around with a belt. This was actually part of the outer garments that the priest would wear. But David is a very expressive individual, and so he's a musician. He is a dancer. He has that very artistic aspect about him, and so he is dancing before the Lord in this relatively small clothing. It's not, we might consider it to be a little bit going a little bit too far with the clothing, but in our culture. But David is doing something for a very specific reason. David is humbling himself before the Lord. He's laid aside his kingly garments. He's not sitting up in a balcony watching the procession. He is active. He's a part of it, and he's showing that even though I'm the king, I am still below the Lord. And my job is still to please God and to honor him. And here's what's interesting. The second time that they try to bring the ark in, it's successful. They succeed in bringing the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem, and God blesses. You see, when we approach God on his terms, our actions and motivations will be acceptable. So it's not just an issue of, do I have good motivation? It is a point of, am I doing the right thing as well? See, it is possible to have the right motivation and do the wrong thing, and it's also possible to have the wrong motivation in doing a good thing. David marries both of them, and as a result of his actions and motivations being proper at this time, it is found to be acceptable. No problems, no issues. In fact, just the opposite. God blesses greatly. And it says in verse 17, they brought the ark of the Lord and set it in its place inside the tent David had set up for it. Then David offered burnt offerings and fellowship offerings in the Lord's presence. And when David had finished the offering the burnt offerings and the fellowship offerings, he blessed the people in the name of Yahweh of hosts. Then he distributed a loaf of bread, a date cake, and a raisin cake to each one in the entire Israelite community, both men and women. Then all the people left, each to his own home. And when David returned home to bless his household, Saul's daughter Michal came out to meet him. How the king of Israel honored himself today, she said. He exposed himself today in the sight of the slave girls of his subjects like a vulgar person would expose himself. And David replied to Michal, I was dancing before the Lord, who chose me over your father and his whole family to appoint me ruler over the Lord's people, Israel. I will celebrate before the Lord, and I will humble myself even more and humiliate myself. I will be honored by the slave girls you spoke about. And Saul's daughter Michal had no child to the day of her death. Now, it is important to remember a little bit about who Michal is. Michal was the daughter of Saul, and her being married to David goes back all the way years and years before this, when David killed Goliath. The promise, the reward for killing Goliath that Saul had offered was that the person who killed him would receive his daughter's hand in marriage, essentially becoming a member of the royal family via marriage. And so David had married her in accordance to the promise of Saul. And so Michal had been brought up. She had been raised in the household of the king. She believed, that being this high society person, being this royal person, that you were supposed to conduct yourself in a certain way. Her problem with David is that David was not doing that. See, David's worship, celebrating, and dancing was approved by God because he was willing to humble himself before the Lord. That's the point that David is making. I was humbling myself before the Lord, and God found it acceptable. Michal, however, said, David, you're the king. You're supposed to be above all of that. You're supposed to be better than that. You're supposed to live better than all of the regular people. You're supposed to be superior. You're an elite, David. And David looks at this and his position is, no, I'm just a person. I am a servant of the Lord, and I should act and should humble myself like anyone. And so Michal comes in, she says, oh, how dare you, David, because now, all these slave girls and all these people, they're not seeing you as the king. They're not seeing you as royalty. They're not seeing you according to your stature. Michal's condemned because she believed that David's dignity and the office mattered more than the Lord himself. And by the way, sometimes we can do that as well. We come into church, and in the time of worship, we are concerned, what if I do so-and-so? What if I do this? What are people going to think? Who cares? It's not about what other people think. The only opinion that matters during worship is the Lord. And if the Lord's dealing with you during worship and you want to come down to the altar and spend some time in prayer, by all means, do that. If the Lord's working and the Lord's touching hearts and lives, that is the important thing. You see, acceptable worship leaves self at the door and it focuses on the Lord. And what I mean by that is you are no longer concerned about what you like, what you don't like. It doesn't matter about who you are or what your position is. It doesn't matter about your culture. It doesn't matter about your personality. Yes, all of that comes into play. And as the person that God created engages with the Lord in a proper, biblically proper way, it's all right. You worship. And some people may not like it, but that's their problem. See, here's the simple truth. Worship should never be about what the person next to you is doing or not doing. We leave self at the door. When we come into worship, we must worship the Lord. And it doesn't matter what the people around us do. That's the point. That's the truth. That's the reality of worship. You leave self behind. Because worship, whether it is singing in the songs as a congregation, whether it's giving during the offering, whether it's praying during prayer time, no matter what, that worship time, it is about the Lord, and it is about releasing self so that you can focus on Him. That's what David did, and that's what Michal failed to do. David is blessed. His dancing, his celebration, the Lord sees nothing wrong with it. Nowhere in Scripture will you ever find any issue with David being condemned for what he did on that day. He made a big failure the first time, but that's because he didn't follow God's instructions. But you do find that Michal is condemned. And she suffers because she is more concerned about self. She's more concerned about her appearance. She's more concerned about what other people think than what the Lord does. The simple fact is, Michal sat up in the balcony to watch the goings on. She didn't participate. She wasn't there. She watched from a distance. David went down and gave the Lord everything that day. David went down and he served the Lord and he ministered to God's people. Michal sat up on the balcony and judged David and everyone else who worshiped and celebrated that day. That should never be us. That should never be the believer in a corporate worship setting. It should never be a situation in which we sit and we are concerned about what anyone else does or doesn't do. Jesus said that those who worship must worship in spirit and truth. Truth is that those instructions, those directions, those things that God says is what you're supposed to do. Period. It's about obedience. Spirit is about individuality. And it is about the individual fully engaging. When David got it together, when David put those 2 points together, he got it right. It's when one or both are lacking that the worship becomes unacceptable and becomes nothing more than a show. Thank you for joining in on this Bible study. If you have not done so, please like and share this video so that we can share God's Word. We would also like to ask you to subscribe to our channel here and check us out on Facebook. And if you're in the Fort Worth area, know that you're always welcome to join us for any of our services and Bible study.